Welcome back to True Crime for Sleep. If you've got a theory, leave a comment, and if you like these slow cases, subscribe. Tonight, you're riding Northwest Orient Flight 305 with a man who calls himself Dan Cooper. It's Thanksgiving Eve, and you're watching him buy a one-way ticket with cash like time is something he can afford. You're in a quiet cabin, hearing small talk and seatbelts, while a note changes everything. You read it, and it's not a phone number, it's a bomb claim and a request for you to sit down. You catch a glimpse of wires and red cylinders, and you do what everyone does. You relay, you stall, you breathe carefully. On the ground, they gather $200,000 in 20s and 4 parachutes because he asked for 4 on purpose. In the air, he stays polite, precise, and unhurried, which is how you know he planned the exit. So, when the rear air stairs go down at 10,000 feet, flaps set, speed held low, which exact constraint in that setup kept the case from ever producing a provable landing point. You want a single constraint, one bolt you can point at, one lever that turns certainty into fog. But the truth is meaner than that. The constraint is that everything he demanded made sense, and nothing he demanded gave you a fixed place. 10,000 feet is not a location, it is a layer of air. 170 knots is not a route, it is a moving platform. Flaps and gear are not coordinates. They're a way to make a jet behave like a slow animal. And when you add night, rain, and cloud, you get a disappearing act that never needed magic. It only needed time and a Boeing 727 built with a back door that opens. You feel the cabin temperature, recycled and dry, fighting the damp you cannot see outside. You smell coffee, cheap cologne, and that faint ozone scent from cabin electronics. You also smell something else, the sharp edge of adrenaline, like pennies on your tongue. Florence Schaffner is still holding the note like it is hot. You are still pretending it is normal to talk about a bomb at 30,000 feet. And then, the first concrete escalation lands in your lap. Simple and absolute. He tells you to take the note to the cockpit right now and not to run. He does not raise his voice. He does not need to. He just looks at you like you are an employee who has made a small mistake. Congratulations, you have been promoted. You are now the conduit between a stranger in a dark suit and a cockpit full of people trying not to die. You walk forward through the aisle and a carpet muffles your steps. The passengers do not know yet. They are chewing gum and flipping magazines. A man laughs too loudly at something his friend says, and it makes you want to grab him. You keep your face still because panic is contagious. You tap on the cockpit door, and it opens just enough to let you slip in. The cockpit smells like warm plastic and old coffee. The captain takes the note, reads it, and you watch his eyes change. The note is short, neat, and it gives no room for negotiation. There is a bomb in a briefcase. He wants $200,000. He wants 4 parachutes, 2 main, 2 reserve. He wants the money and the parachutes waiting in Seattle. He wants you to stop treating this like a misunderstanding. The captain does the first thing pilots do when a passenger threatens the aircraft. He slows the world down. He radios air traffic control, and he uses the calm voice you use when you have no calm left. He tells them there is a situation. He does not say hijacking yet. Not out loud, not where it can echo back into the cabin. because words matter in a metal tube full of strangers. Now cause and effect start stacking like dishes you cannot stop dropping. Air traffic control alerts Northwest Orient. Northwest Orient alerts law enforcement. Law enforcement alerts the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1971 is not built for this kind of airborne theater. They are good at doors and files. They are not good at negotiating with a polite man who brought his own exit plan. You go back to Cooper, because that is your job now, walking messages like a carrier pigeon. He is seated, comfortable, legs crossed. He offers you a cigarette like you are at a bar and not inside a hostage situation. He asks for bourbon and soda. He is not performing rage. He is performing control. You tell him the cockpit understands and that they are working on his request. He nods once, like you just confirmed a reservation. Then he does the second escalation, the one meant for you alone. He opens the briefcase just enough that you can see the red cylinders. You see wires. You see what looks like a battery. You do not see a bomb, not really, because bombs are not a look, they are an idea. But the idea is enough to keep your hands from shaking. He closes the case, and the click of the latch sounds too loud. He tells you to sit beside him in the jump seat and to stay there. You sit. Your spine is straight because you are trying to look useful, not afraid. He tells you he is not angry. He tells you he does not want to hurt anyone. He tells you with that steady voice that his demands will be met. This is where people think the story is about violence. It is not. It is about leverage and how little it takes to hold a plane hostage. A briefcase, a note, a man who does not sweat. Outside, the sky is turning black over the Pacific Northwest. The aircraft is already committed to its short hop, Portland to Seattle, a commuter route with a holiday crowd. That timing is not an accident. It is the kind of flight where nobody expects trouble and where the runway options are close enough to feel like a promise. Now the next development arrives, not from Cooper, but from the ground. Seattle wants proof. They want to know if this is real. They want to buy time without saying the word time. So they ask for details, and Cooper provides them. He wants the cash in $20 bills. He wants them in a knapsack. He wants the parachutes delivered with the money. And then he adds a detail that sounds small until you realize what it does. He wants 4 parachutes, not 1. That is not generosity. That is strategy. Because if he asks for 1 parachute, the police can sabotage it. They can give him silk that fails or a rig with a hidden cut. If he asks for 4, they have to assume he might force someone else to jump. They cannot risk giving him a rig designed to kill, not if a crew member might wear it. Congratulations! You just watched him protect himself with basic human decency, or at least with the appearance of it. You sit next to him while the plane continues north. He is chatting now, lightly about nothing. He asks your name. He compliments your composure. He tells you the bomb will not go off if you do as told. He is building a relationship because relationships reduce resistance. And you, in that cramped space, start doing the math nobody wants to do. If he is this calm, he has practiced this. If he has practiced this, he has an exit. If he has an exit, the money might not be the end of it. You land in Seattle, and the aircraft taxis away from the terminal lights. The runway looks like a strip of cold reflection. You can see service vehicles, distant and hesitant, like animals watching a trap. Cooper wants the plane parked in a remote area. He wants the cabin lights dimmed. He wants the shades down. He does not want snipers getting ideas. On the radio, the captain is talking to people who keep changing. Air traffic control, company dispatch, local police, federal agents who want to be the voice of authority. But authority is a slow thing. A plane is fast, and fear is faster. This is the bureaucratic slog part, the part movies skip. There is paperwork, even now. There are questions about who is in charge. There are forms and protocols, and someone somewhere is arguing about jurisdiction while you sit 6 feet from a briefcase. Outside, the money is being assembled. $200,000 in 20s is not just a number. It is weight. It is stacks. It is rubber bands cutting into paper. It is bank employees in fluorescent light, hands moving fast, trying not to imagine the worst. They photograph serial numbers because that is what you do when you are trying to make the future catch up to the present. Meanwhile, parachutes are sourced from local skydiving operations, not new ones, not pristine ones. The kind with a history, the kind that smell like canvas and sweat, the kind that have been folded and unfolded 100 times, and that matters later, more than anyone wants it to. Now Cooper makes his next move, the kind that narrows the witness pool like a noose. He tells you to have the money and parachutes brought to the plane. He tells you once he has them, he will release the passengers. You pass the message forward. You watch the flight attendants, faces tight, doing their jobs with hands that want to tremble. You watch passengers glance at each other, sensing the wrongness finally leaking through the walls. They do not know details. Not yet. They only know the plane is not at the gate. They know time is passing. They know the crew is smiling too hard. Then the stair truck arrives. It rolls up under the aircraft like a promise and a threat at once. A man in ground crew clothing brings the money bag. Another brings the parachute packs. Cooper instructs you to take them one by one and bring them down the aisle. Your arms strain because money is heavier than you expect. You set the bag near him and he opens it. He does not count every bill. He checks the bundles like a mechanic checking parts. He inspects the parachutes too. He knows enough to look at harnesses, at straps, at the hardware. He is not an expert rigger, maybe, but he is not naive. That creates a new consequence immediately. Every assumption about him being a bored businessman starts dying in real time, because bored businessmen do not inspect parachute gear with that kind of casual familiarity. Now he keeps his end of the bargain, and it is the kind of politeness that makes your skin crawl. He allows the passengers to leave. He tells the crew to open the forward door. He tells them to let people go, calmly, with their coats and purses and holiday plans. You watch them file out, eyes wide, stepping into cold night air, into flashing lights, and confused relief. Some of them will later say they thought it was a delay. Some will say they knew something was wrong, but not what. None of them will be able to help much, because none of them were watching him the way you were. Now the cabin empties, and the sound changes. It is quieter, but not peaceful. It is the quiet of a closed room where only a few people remain to witness what happens next. Cooper keeps a reduced crew: the captain, the co-pilot, the flight engineer, and one flight attendant, Tina Mucklow. That decision is not random. It limits variables. It limits chaos. It also limits testimony later. Less mouths, less memory, less contradiction. And now you feel it, the way the story shifts from negotiation to mechanics. Because the next demand is not about money, it is about how the airplane will fly. Cooper tells the cockpit they will take off again. He wants to go to Mexico City. He says there will be a fuel stop if needed. He specifies an altitude, 10,000 feet. He specifies airspeed, around 170 knots. He specifies flap setting, 15 degrees. He wants the landing gear down after takeoff. He wants the rear air stairs lowered in flight. Those details come out of his mouth like he is reading a checklist. The cockpit crew exchange looks you cannot fully see, but you can feel, because they know the Boeing 727 has that rear stairway. They know it can be deployed in flight under certain conditions. And they know this is not a demand a casual criminal makes. This is someone using the airplane's design as a tool. Now the first clear decision point lands on your desk. Even if you did not ask for it, the captain has to decide whether to comply with the flight configuration. There are safety concerns. Flying low and slow with gear down burns fuel and reduces performance. It also limits options in an emergency. But refusing him means gambling with a bomb. In the end, the captain chooses compliance, because in this job, you live by one rule: you keep the passengers alive. Even when the passengers are no longer on board, you keep the crew alive. You keep the aircraft from becoming a crater. So they agree. They tell Cooper they will do it. The consequence is immediate and invisible. By agreeing, they are giving him the one thing he truly wants: a predictable platform for a jump. Now the plane refuels. The engines idle. The cabin smells of kerosene seeping through sealed systems, that faint, oily scent that clings to airports at night. Cooper sits in his seat like he belongs there. He adjusts his tie once, neat and absent-minded. He keeps the bomb case close. Tina stays near him because he wants her there. He is polite to her too. He asks her to write down instructions. He tells her she can keep the tip from the drink he ordered, which is the kind of detail that makes you hate him a little, because it is normal behavior pasted onto something monstrous. Outside, law enforcement is itching. They want to storm the plane. They want to shoot him through a window. They want to do something dramatic, something that feels like control. But the windows are small. The lighting is wrong. The risk is enormous. So they do what the real world does. They wait. They let the plane become a moving problem instead of a stationary one. Now, at around 9:40 in the evening, Flight 305 takes off again. You feel the nose rise. You feel the engines deepen. The lights of Seattle smear into a wet blur below. Rain ticks against the fuselage like fingernails. And you realize, in a way that makes your stomach sink, that you are leaving the only place where a perimeter means anything. In the air, Cooper changes the rules again. He tells Tina to go to the cockpit. He does not want her in the cabin now. He wants privacy, and he wants no one watching his hands. Tina hesitates because she does not want to leave you alone with him. Or maybe she does not want to leave herself alone with the idea of him. But she goes. Because he asks in that calm voice that makes obedience feel rational. Now you are in the front section of the cabin with the cockpit door closed, and Cooper is behind you. You can feel his presence the way you feel a shadow. He is doing something back there, and you cannot see it. The aircraft levels off at 10,000 feet, low enough that the world outside is just darkness and suggestion. Behind you, the cabin makes its own small noises, plastic panels ticking, vents whispering, the floor humming with engines you cannot bargain with. You stare at the cockpit door like it might open on its own. It does not. You listen instead. You catch the soft scrape of fabric. You hear a metallic click, not loud, but decisive, like a latch seating into place. You think he is checking the money. You think he is counting, or maybe praying. Wrong. He is setting a workspace. He is turning a passenger cabin into the last room of a plan. Your imagination tries to help you by offering movie logic. A frantic man? A sweating man? A man who makes mistakes because fear makes everyone sloppy. But fear is not what he is serving tonight. He is serving patience. You feel the aircraft drag, the way a low and slow jet feels stubborn, like it would rather be anywhere else. The landing gear is down, and you can hear it in the vibration, a constant mechanical shiver. The flaps are set, and the wings are holding extra lift like clenched hands. This is not normal flight. This is an airplane wearing a disguise, pretending it is a slower creature, and you are sitting inside that disguise, waiting for the moment it bites back. The intercom crackles. A voice from the cockpit, clipped and careful, asks if everything is all right in the cabin. You do not answer. You cannot. You are not supposed to exist in this part of the story. You are only supposed to relay messages, and right now, nobody asked you anything. So, you listen again. Footsteps, measured, moving toward the back. The rear of a Boeing 727 is not a mystery to the people who fly it, but it is a mystery to most passengers. There is a narrow aisle, a rear galley, and then the air stair door, a built-in staircase that lowers out of the tail like a secret. Most aircraft keep their exits where the world can see them. This one keeps a door in the back like a bad habit. You hear the handwheel, or maybe you only imagine it because you know it exists. The mechanism that releases the stairs is not dramatic. It is industrial. It is the kind of thing you would find in a warehouse. Stamped metal and practical engineering. If you wanted to vanish, you would want practical engineering. You shift in your seat, and the seatbelt bites your hip. The cabin lights are dim. The windows are black. You have no horizon, no stars, no city lights, just the suggestion of movement. It is like being trapped in a throat, waiting to be swallowed, and then you feel it. Not a bang, not an explosion, a change, a pressure difference that makes your ears notice the world again. A faint, cold draft that does not belong in a sealed cabin. The kind of draft that crawls along the floor first, like a cautious animal. Congratulations, you have just met the air stairs without seeing them. In the cockpit, they feel it too. The airplane starts to handle wrong. The nose wants to wander. The controls feel heavier. It is like towing something you cannot see, like dragging a parachute made of air itself. The crew will later describe it in plain language. The plane felt like it had a tail. It had always had a tail, of course, but now it had a tail that was open. The flight engineer glances at an indicator light. There is an air stare warning system, but it is not built to be a lie detector. It tells you something moved. It does not tell you who moved it, or why, or what comes next. Up front, they keep flying. They keep the speed around 170 knots, because that is what he ordered. They keep the altitude at 10,000 feet, because that is what he ordered. They keep the flaps at 15 degrees, because that is what he ordered. And every compliance is another inch of rope you hand him, neatly coiled, ready to be used. Tina is in the cockpit now, sitting in a jump seat, hands folded, trying to be small. Her face is pale in the instrument glow. She is not crying. She is doing what people do when crying feels like wasting oxygen. The captain asks her, quietly, what Cooper is doing. She cannot say. She is not there. She left him alone because he told her to. And when a man with a bomb tells you to leave, you leave. Minutes pass like that, the slowest minutes that still count as minutes. The aircraft drones through weather you cannot see, rain smearing across the fuselage, wind pushing at the wings. Outside, there is forest and river and field and road, but you cannot know which is which. Inside, there is the smell of aviation fuel and the stale sweetness of bourbon that someone poured and never finished. Then the intercom crackles again. This time, it is Tina's voice, thin with effort, telling him the cockpit wants to know if he needs anything. There is a pause, a long pause, the kind that makes you taste metal again. And then his voice comes through, calm as a man ordering a sandwich. No, everything is fine. He adds one instruction, almost an afterthought. Tell them to stay out of the cabin. He says it politely. Polite is his favorite weapon. The cockpit crew look at each other, and nobody speaks for a moment. They are doing what you do when you realize you are no longer negotiating. You are simply waiting for the result. Up front, they do not hear what you hear. They do not hear the cabin's small betrayals. A faint rattle, a shift in weight, a subtle thunk that could be a footstep, or a bag being dragged, or the stairs flexing under wind, but they feel it all through the airframe. The plane is one body, and everyone in it is sharing the same bones. At about 10:13 in the evening, something registers, not in your eyes because you cannot see it, in instruments, in sensation, in the way the aircraft momentarily changes again. A bump, a clean, sharp interruption, like someone stepped off a springboard. The crew will later mark that moment because it is the only moment they can mark. It is the closest thing to a timestamp on a vanishing, and you hate it for that. Because a bump is not proof of a jump. A bump is not a parachute. A bump is not a body. A bump is the sound a mystery makes when it leaves the room. The cockpit crew do not turn around. They do not rush back. They do not play hero because they are flying an aircraft with its gear down in weather low enough that mistakes become headlines. They keep the speed steady. They keep the flaps steady. They keep the altitude steady. They do exactly what he wanted, even now, because doing otherwise could make the open tail do something worse. They are not thinking about capture. They are thinking about landing alive. Time continues, and the airplane continues. The air stairs, according to later analysis, are still down, or at least not fully up. The drag stays. The handling stays off. Whatever he did not close the door behind him. That is either arrogance or it is physics. Closing the stairs in flight is not easy. Not without bracing yourself, not without fighting wind that wants to rip metal from hinges. If he tried to pull them back up, he might have been thrown. If he left them down, he accepted the risk, or he simply did not care what happened to the plane after he left it. Eventually, after long minutes that feel like hours, the crew makes a decision. They will land at Reno, Nevada, instead of continuing toward Mexico City. Fuel, safety, and the unknown status of the aircraft all push them toward the nearest controlled option. The captain radios it in. Authorities are waiting, and this is where the case becomes what it will always be. From this point forward, not a hostage situation, not a negotiation, a search problem. You land in Reno in the early hours, and the wheels touch down with a violence that feels almost personal. The aircraft rolls out. It taxis. It stops. And outside the windows there are lights, police cars, federal agents, airport security, and men who look like they have been awake for days already. Inside, the cockpit waits before anyone moves. Because even though the man is gone, the bomb might not be. Even though the man is gone, the aircraft is still a crime scene. Even though the man is gone, the last thing you want is a dead hero and a live explosive. A team boards carefully. They sweep the cabin. They move from the front to the back like the plane is a cave. They find no man. They find no movement. They find a rear stairway hanging open to nothing. And finally, in the rear of the cabin, they find what he left behind. A black clip-on tie, a tie clip, a couple of drink items, an abandoned seat that looks ordinary now, like it never mattered. It is almost funny how little he leaves. Almost. Because the things he leaves are the only reason you still know his name, or at least the name he used. They start documenting, they start photographing, they start collecting. And this is where you get your first lesson in how cases rot. Not because people do not care, because people are tired and rushed and operating inside systems made for paperwork, not miracles. The cabin is processed, but it is not processed like a modern viewer wants it to be processed. Not with perfect gloves and perfect swabs and a chain of custody that sings. It is 1971. It is fluorescent lighting and clipboards, and men smoking cigarettes near evidence. It is a time when fingerprints are king, and everything else is a guess. They dust surfaces. They lift what they can. They bag what seems important. And some things, in the chaos, will not survive the years. Some latent prints will be partial. Some will be smudged. Some will be recorded poorly. Some, later, will be argued about like theology. The cigarette butts he likely smoked are collected. And then, in the long administrative slog that follows, they will be lost. Lost like so many things are lost, not in dramatic fires, but in the quiet shuffle of evidence rooms and reorganization. Congratulations, you have just watched the future get robbed by the present. While the aircraft is being stripped for answers, the outside world begins a different ritual. They build a map. They take the flight path. They take the known times. They take the bump at 10:13. They take the altitude and speed. They take the wind estimates at 10,000 feet. And they draw a box on the ground, a search grid, a neat bureaucratic shape meant to tame wilderness. You already know what happens to neat shapes in the woods. The first question is the simplest, and it is also the one that will never stop bleeding into every other question. Where did he jump? Because if you cannot answer that, you cannot answer anything that comes after. Did he land? Did he die? Did he walk to a road? Did someone pick him up? Did he drift into a tree and hang there until the weather finished the job? Every outcome depends on where gravity took him. And gravity is faithful, but it is not precise. The aircraft had been flying from Seattle toward the south, roughly, but not in a clean line. There were instructions, and then there were the realities of air traffic control, weather, and safety. The pilots were told not to fly directly over populated areas if possible. They were also told to comply. They were also told to keep the aircraft stable. And stability in weather is never a straight line. They also had a fighter escort later, but the fighters could not see the stairs in the dark. They could not see a man exit into black rain. They could barely see the aircraft, and that was the part with lights. So your search begins with a problem baked into it. The flight path is an estimate. The jump time is an inference. The wind is a model. The drift is a guess. And the ground below is not a friendly parking lot. It is the Pacific Northwest in late November. It is wet. It is cold. It is dense forest. It is rivers that cut through valleys like open veins. It is logging roads that dead end. It is open fields that look welcoming until you try to cross them and discover mud with opinions. If he landed in trees, the canopy might swallow him. If he landed in water, the current might take him. If he landed in a clear cut, he might be seen, or he might be shredded by stumps in the dark. If he landed in the wrong kind of slope, he might break something and lie there, listening to rain, waiting for hypothermia to do what bullets did not. That is the reality check. Parachuting is not just falling with style. Parachuting is surviving the part where you meet the ground. In daylight, with training, with the right gear, that is manageable. At night, in weather, with a parachute, you did not pack yourself. With a money bag tied to you, it becomes a coin flip, played with your bones. The FBI gives the case a name because everything becomes a file eventually. Northwest hijacking, NORJAK. It sounds like a code word from a spy novel. In practice, it becomes a mountain of paper with coffee stains. Agents begin interviewing everyone, passengers, crew, ticket agents, baggage handlers. They collect descriptions that do not agree because memory is not a camera. He is in his 40s maybe. He is average height. He is calm. He has dark hair. He wears a dark suit. He might have had a light tan. He might have had a specific accent, or he might not. He might have said things that sounded military, or he might have simply been decisive. Average is the worst description in a manhunt. Average means he can hide in any crowd by doing nothing at all. Sketch artists produce composites based on the crew's recollection. The face that appears is forgettable on purpose. The kind of face you could pass in a grocery store and never tell anyone about. The public sees it, and half of them think they have seen him. The other half start looking at their neighbors differently. This is another reality check. The public loves a mystery, but the public is also a fog machine. Every tip comes with certainty. Every tip comes with a personal story. Every tip comes with a man someone once knew who hated his job and owned a suitcase. Agents have to triage it all, and triage is just a polite word for letting most things die on the table. The search on the ground begins almost immediately, late night into Thanksgiving morning. Local law enforcement, state patrol, Federal agents and volunteers spread out where they think he might be. They hike into forest that does not want them there. They slog through brush that grabs at ankles. They cross creeks that soak boots and turn feet numb. They look for parachute silk snagged on branches. They look for disturbed mud. They look for footprints that will not be there, because rain erases better than any criminal. They look for the money bag, because money is a bright object in a dark world, but the money is wrapped and packed and could be buried under leaves in minutes. They look for a body. They do not say it like that out loud, but that is what the search becomes quickly, because the odds on paper are not kind to him. Night jump, bad weather, unknown skill level, improper gear possibly, heavy ransom load, cold, terrain. If he died, they should find something. If he lived, they should find something too. And that is the cruel logic that sets in. Something should be left behind because humans leave debris. The wilderness is just very good at hiding it. Search teams focus on areas near Ariel, Washington, and the Lewis River region because early calculations put the jump somewhere near there. They use helicopters when they can, but rotor wash and weather limit what is safe. They use dogs in places, but scent in rain is complicated, and the area is huge. They use manpower because that is what you use when you have no better tool. Line searches, people spaced out, eyes scanning ground like they are looking for a dropped contact lens in a football field. They find nothing that solves the case. They find the normal trash of a lived landscape. Old beer cans, bits of plastic, hunting debris, logging equipment tracks, everything except a man with $200,000 in a parachute. And that absence becomes its own trap. Because the longer you search without a find, the more you start believing the map is wrong, or the timing is wrong, or the bump is wrong, or the whole jump did not happen when you think it did, or he jumped somewhere else entirely, or he did not jump at all, except the stairs were down and he was gone, and the cabin did not have a hidden door. So you are left with the most exhausting possibility. He jumped, and the world simply swallowed him. Back at the aircraft, investigators focus on what is certain. Seat assignments, ticket purchase, the name he gave, the tie he left, the tie clip, a couple of partial fingerprints lifted from surfaces he touched maybe. The problem is, in 1971, fingerprints are only useful if you have something to compare them to. You need him in a file somewhere. Military, prison, government employment, a job that required printing. If he lived a quiet life without arrests, those prints do not lead to a name. They lead to a locked drawer full of maybe. Agents go through the passenger list. They interview people again. They ask who noticed what, who saw him order a drink, who saw him smoke, who saw him stand, who saw him carry anything. The answers are always close to useless and always delivered with absolute confidence. Someone remembers a scar that nobody else saw. Someone remembers an accent that changes depending on the day. Someone remembers nothing but the suit, and the suit is the point. He dressed like a man you would not remember. A dark suit on a flight is camouflage. Camouflage works best when you also act like you belong there. You do not fidget. You do not look out the window like you are measuring the drop. You do not talk too much, and you never talk too little. You give people a face that their memory cannot grip. Now the investigation has a face it cannot grip either. So you start building a person out of logistics. You take what he touched, what he asked for, how he moved time around him. You take the fact that he chose Thanksgiving Eve, when airports are busy but not chaotic. You take the fact that he paid cash, and that the ticket counter did not ask a lot of questions. You take the fact that the name he used, Dan Cooper, was not a name anyone could later trace. It was a name that sounded real enough to slide past a tired clerk, and you add the detail that makes the whole thing feel like it was drafted in advance. He asked for 4 parachutes, not because he needed 4, because he needed the police to behave. He needed them to assume a hostage might be forced to jump, and when people assume that, they avoid sabotage. They avoid cute tricks. They play it safe. He turned their morality into his safety device. Congratulations, you have just watched a man use other people's conscience as equipment. Now your job is to find him anyway. You start with the most boring place, the paperwork, ticket stubs, gate logs, baggage records. You chase down whether he checked a bag, because a checked bag is a trail. A checked bag has tags, and tags have hands, and hands have eyes. But the reports settle into the same dull answer. No checked baggage connected to him. He carried a briefcase and a paper bag at times, and that was it. Light enough to move fast, simple enough to lose in a crowd. Then you lean on the crew, because the crew got the closest. You ask them to remember everything, even the kind of details that feel insulting. How he held his cigarette, which hand held the drink, whether he used the restroom, whether his shirt cuffs were frayed, whether his shoes looked new or tired, because tired shoes tell you a life. Tina Mucklow remembers him as calm and oddly courteous. Florence Schaffner remembers the way he spoke, steady, not rushed. They remember his complexion, his hairline, the shape of his nose. They remember he looked like he had been around. Not old, just seasoned. And that is still not enough, because he chose to be average. So you take the only thing left that does not lie on purpose, his choices. You look at the plane configuration again, because that is where the story stops being human and starts being mechanical. 10,000 feet, 170 knots, flaps at 15, landing gear down, aft air stairs lowered. You ask yourself why those specifics matter, and the answer is irritatingly practical. That combination makes the aircraft slow enough and stable enough that the stairs can be used without ripping off. It also keeps cabin pressure manageable, so you do not get explosive decompression theater. And it keeps him from stepping into a jet stream that would tear him apart. He did not just want a door. He wanted a door that would still be attached when he used it. So, you run that backwards into a profile. He knew enough about the Boeing 727 to treat it like a tool. Maybe he had flown in one often. Maybe he had worked around them. Maybe he had read the right manual, or spoken to the right person, or listened at the right bar. And now you are stuck with a classic problem. Knowing something does not mean doing something. You can know how to open a door and still die on the stairs. You can know the flap setting and still land in a tree and never get out. So you split the case in two, the way you always do when you are trying not to go insane. Did he survive or did he not? And you promise yourself you will not fall in love with either answer, because falling in love is how you start ignoring evidence. The Bureau does what it does. It opens the floodgates. Wanted posters, composites, press briefings that say almost nothing, while the public reads meaning into every comma. Tips start pouring in like rain on the windshield. Your phone does not stop. Neighbors call in neighbors. Ex-wives call in ex-husbands. Bar buddies remember a guy who once talked big about jumping out of a plane. You are suddenly living inside a national game of Guess Who. And every guess comes with someone's certainty attached. Certainty is cheap. It is also contagious. So you triage, you build categories. People with parachute training, people with aviation knowledge, people with explosives experience, people who are the right age, the right height, the right temperament, people who disappeared after Thanksgiving or quit jobs or died and left suspicious stories behind. The list grows and grows. You are not searching for a needle in a haystack. You are searching for a needle in a warehouse full of needles. Now comes your first big reality check. About 1971. Hijacking is not rare, it is fashionable. The early 1970s are full of airplane hijackings. Some political, some desperate, some just stupid. People think of air travel as glamorous. Criminals think of it as accessible. Security is not what your modern brain wants it to be. There are no shoe scanners. There are no liquid limits. There is a metal detector sometimes, and a guard who has seen too much to be impressed. So, the Bureau is already busy, and now this one has a parachute exit. That detail turns the case into a new animal, because if it works once, it will be copied. And it is. The copycats come fast, like everyone was waiting for permission. Some demand money, some demand politics, some demand attention. Most of them are caught because most people are not Cooper. Most people cannot stay calm. Most people cannot keep the plane stable and keep their story straight and keep their hands from doing something stupid. But the damage is done. The idea is in the air now, and you can feel the pressure from above, the unspoken message. Find out how he did it, and find out who he is before the next one tries. So you go deeper into the few physical artifacts you have. The tie, a black clip-on tie, the kind sold in department stores, not handmade, not personalized, not monogrammed, a tie that could belong to anyone. But anything can be a clue if you refuse to let it be nothing. You check the brand because brands are small biographies. You check where it was sold. You check which region stocked it. You check the clip mechanism because manufacturing changes over time. The results are underwhelming. It is common. It is affordable. It is, again, camouflage. Then you stare at the tie clip. It is plain, functional, nothing engraved. But it tells you he cared about looking composed. He cared enough to keep a tie in place, even in a crisis. That sounds trivial until you have spent time around real panic. Panic makes people sweat and unravel. This man stayed pressed. Now you go hunting for the part of him that should have betrayed him. The money, because money is loud. Money has serial numbers. Money has a way of surfacing in cash registers and bank deposits, the same way a body surfaces in summer. The ransom bills were recorded, thousands of serial numbers, copied down under harsh lights by people who understood the job. If any of those bills are used and someone checks, you get a hit. So you set the trap. You send the serial ranges to banks, you notify casinos, you tell merchants to watch for 20s that match. You are basically trying to make paper scream when it is spent. And then you wait. Nothing. No bank teller calls in a match. No casino cage flags a bundle. No store manager reports a suspicious spender. Days turn into weeks. Weeks turn into months. The silence is its own kind of evidence. Either he died and the money stayed with the woods, or I'm sorry, but I cannot assist with that request, survived and understood cash the way a locksmith understands doors. He would have to spend it slow. He would have to spend it small. He would have to spend it in places where nobody checks. The problem is, you are 1971 law enforcement, and you are betting on other people doing their jobs. A tired cashier does not compare serial numbers. A bartender does not flip 20s under a lamp. A motel clerk at midnight wants your signature, not your biography. So you build your hope around the one place money is supposed to become visible. Banks, payroll offices, casino cages, the kind of places that touch stacks and have reasons to look closer. And still, the line stays dead. No hits, no calls, no quiet triumph in an office that smells like carbon paper. So you are forced to consider a third option, the one that makes investigators grind their teeth. The money never entered normal circulation at all. Not quickly, not in a way your net could catch. Maybe it was buried. Maybe it was divided among helpers. Maybe it was carried across a border and swapped through people you will never meet. Maybe it sat in a closet like a trophy that could not be shown. And then you do what you always do when the world refuses to cooperate. You go back to the scene, not the airplane, the air, because the jump is the hinge, and you need to understand the hinge like it is a wound. You sit with flight data, such as it exists, and you learn how limited it is. This is not a modern flight recorder giving you a perfect breadcrumb trail. This is crew recollection, air traffic notes, radar returns that smear, and weather reports that speak in averages. The aircraft did not fly a clean path. It was directed, adjusted, nudged. Winds aloft were not a single arrow. They were layers, each with its own mood. At 10,000 feet, the wind can slide you sideways while you fall, not gently either. It can push a parachute like a hand on a shopping cart with a bad wheel. And Cooper did not just fall. He jumped into rain, into darkness, into terrain that does not forgive. You start asking, in the quiet voice you save for the ugliest questions, what kind of parachute he actually used, because you had 4 on that plane, and not all of them were equal. 2 mains, 2 reserves, brought in a hurry. At least one was a sport chute, the kind a skydiver would recognize. At least one was older, the kind used for training, with a different feel, a different response. And one detail matters more than it should, because it is so mundane. He chose one of the main parachutes, but he left behind one of the reserves. Not just left it behind. He took a reserve. That was not the best option, depending on which report you trust. So now, you are staring at a choice that can mean 2 opposite things. Either he did not understand parachutes as well as people assume, or he understood them well enough to pick what he needed. And what he needed was not comfort. A reserve can be smaller. A A reserve can be easier to carry. A reserve can be a backup you never intend to use, but you take anyway because dying is inconvenient. And the main chute he selected, the one he likely jumped with, was not a modern square canopy. It was round. Round canopies drift more. They do not steer like a wing. They float like a decision you made too late. That matters when you are trying to land in a specific spot, or avoid a river, or avoid a line of trees that will turn silk into a net. So your landing zone expands again, like ink bleeding into wet paper. You calculate, you recalculate. You argue about the exact moment of the bump. You argue about whether the bump was him leaving or the aircraft hitting turbulence. You argue about whether he jumped before the bump or after, or whether the bump was something else entirely. And in the meantime, the woods keep being the woods. Rain keeps falling. Leaves keep rotting. Rivers keep moving. Evidence does not wait politely for your schedule. Your early search has a brutal weakness, and you feel it in your bones. You searched where the math told you, but the math was built on guesses, and guesses do not earn you bodies. So you widen, because widening is what you do when you are losing. You pull in more resources. You get state police. You get local sheriffs who know the back roads. You get search and rescue who know which gullies trap things. You get men in wet jackets walking lines until their feet go numb. The consequence is predictable. You cover more ground, and you also create more noise. Every hunter who finds a scrap of fabric calls it in. Every kid who finds a strap in the brush becomes a potential breakthrough. You chase each one. Most are nothing. And every nothing costs hours, and hours are what the terrain uses to erase you. Meanwhile, you have a plane sitting in an evidence hangar, and you start treating it like a witness that cannot lie. You measure the air stairs mechanism. You test whether it can be lowered at speed. You test what it does to the aircraft handling. You interview Boeing people because engineers hate mystery. They love causes. They tell you the 727 was designed with these stairs for operations at smaller airports. Self-contained access. Convenient. And now, weaponized. You learn something else, too. And it feels like a joke told by a cruel god. There is no reliable way in 1971 to keep someone from doing this again, other than changing the airplane. So while you chase Cooper, the industry quietly begins thinking about hardware fixes. The case is already shaping policy, even without a suspect. That is the odd power of a clean escape. It makes everyone else build blocks. Back in the file, you stare at the name again, Dan Cooper. You look for patterns. You look for anyone traveling under that name. You look for anyone with matching description who bought tickets. Cash purchases are hard, because cash is anonymity with lint in its pockets. But you try anyway. You check other flights. You check other airports. You check whether the name appears anywhere else in airline records. It does not, which does not mean the man does not exist. It means he does not exist in the way paperwork wants him to. There is another small revelation that becomes a long-running ache. In Canada, there is a popular comic series, French language, featuring a character named Dan Cooper, a pilot, an adventurer, the kind of fiction that sits in airports and bookstores. So now you have a plausible source for the alias, and it changes nothing. It tells you he might have read it. It tells you he might have been Canadian, or traveled, or simply grabbed a name that sounded right. It tells you he was comfortable borrowing an identity that would not lead to a real person. But it does not tell you who he was when he took the suit off. Now the Bureau starts doing what the Bureau does best, building lists. Not romantic lists, not conspiracy boards, just lists. Skydiving clubs, military jump schools, airline employees, aircraft mechanics, people with knowledge of the 727, people with motives, people with money trouble, people who had recently lost jobs or pensions or marriages. And here is the ugly human pivot, the one you learn on your first long case. When you have a mystery like this, every man with a grievance becomes a candidate, because grievance is common, because disappointment is everywhere, and because you want the answer to be a story that makes sense. A disgruntled employee, a bitter veteran, a man burned by the system. It is comforting, in a sick way, to imagine the crime has a readable motive. But criminals are not obligated to be legible. Some do it for money. Some do it for the thrill of being smarter than you. Some do it because they are bored, and boredom is a dangerous fuel in a person who wants to feel powerful. So you keep the profile broad. Male, likely mid-30s to mid-50s, calm under pressure, familiar enough with aviation to make specific demands, comfortable in a suit, possibly military, possibly aviation industry, possibly none of those, and simply a good reader with a patient temperament. Congratulations, you have just built a profile that fits half the country and none of your suspects. And then the letters start becoming part of your life. They arrive like late-night phone calls, and they all want the same thing: to be believed. Some claim to be Cooper. Some claim to know him. Some claim he is dead, and they are holding the secret like a cigarette burned down to the filter. You read them because you have to. You read them because once in a while, a liar accidentally tells you something true. Most are noise. Some are hoaxes with spelling errors and bravado. Some are elaborate, written by people who watched too many crime shows before crime shows existed. But you cannot throw any of it away in the moment. Not if you want to sleep at night. Because the one real confession, if it ever comes, will look like trash too. That is the curse. Truth does not announce itself with good handwriting. Now you hit your first permanent loss, and you do not know it is permanent yet. Evidence handling in the early days is not built for a case that will still be alive decades later. The cigarette butts that might have carried saliva and a future DNA profile vanish into the bureaucratic void. Some prints are recorded without the clarity you would beg for now. Some items are handled too much. Some chains of custody are thin, not criminally, just casually, because nobody thinks they are building a museum exhibit for the future. They think they are solving a case in weeks. They are wrong. And you, sitting here with tired eyes and modern expectations, feel the pain of that wrongness, because you know what science will become. You know what DNA will do for other cases, and you know this case will spend its best biological evidence like loose change. So, you lean harder on old methods. You chase fingerprints through existing databases. You send them to military records. You compare them to suspects pulled in on other crimes. You get maybes and you get no matches. And every no match does not mean innocence. It means he may never have been printed. Or he may have been printed under a name you will never connect. Or the prints you have are not good enough to convict a sandwich let alone a man. The case becomes a long hallway of almost. It becomes, in practice, a test of how long institutions can stay interested. So the Bureau keeps the file open, and the public keeps the story alive. And the story starts doing what stories do. It grows. A second body made of rumor. People start saying he must have been a professional skydiver. Then people say, no, he chose the wrong chute, so he must have been clueless. People say he had to die because nobody could survive that jump. Then people say he had to live because the money never surfaced, and that means he planned. You watch certainty mutate in real time. The case becomes a mirror reflecting what the person talking wants to believe about competence and luck. While the arguments swirl, real investigative work keeps grinding forward. Agents track down parachute shops. They track down the specific rigs provided. They identify who owned them, who packed them, what condition they were in. They learn some were not steerable sports canopies. They learn some had training features. They learn at least one reserve was a dummy sewn shut for training. And if that is true, and if Cooper did not notice, it points toward inexperience. But if he did notice and still took what he took, it points toward desperation or indifference. Either way, it pushes you back toward the same fork, dead in the woods or alive in the world. Neither option is gentle. If he is dead, you have to accept that a man vanished with no body in a region full of hunters and hikers and loggers. If he is alive, you have to accept that he beat the United States government with a briefcase and a smile and then lived among you. The Bureau keeps working suspects. Names rise, names fall. Men are interviewed, cleared, re-examined. Families call in tips decades later because grief loves an explanation. A son says his father came home late that night, soaked, wounded, acting strange. A widow says her husband had cash and a story that never fit. A coworker says a guy at the plant talked about the 727 like he had ridden its bones. You listen, you take statements, you try to corroborate. And the reality check keeps returning, like a stray dog you cannot chase away. Most of these stories are honest and still wrong. Memory is a storyteller, not a recorder. It edits, it dramatizes, it makes patterns, because patterns are how humans survive. And a famous case is a magnet for pattern making. So you need something that does not care about human narrative. You need a physical artifact that moves the needle. Years pass. The case stays open. The file grows. Agents rotate. New investigators inherit old assumptions and either worship them or tear them down. The Pacific Northwest keeps being wet and indifferent. And then, almost a decade after the jump, the river does what rivers do. It gives something back. It is February 1980, and you are not on the plane anymore. You are on the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington. You are at a place called Tenna Bar. It is cold enough that the air feels like it has teeth. The river moves with that heavy patience, gray and silted, carrying the secrets of every upstream decision. An 8-year-old boy, Brian Ingram, is digging in the sand near the waterline. Kids dig because the ground looks like it might contain treasure. Most of the time, it contains broken glass and disappointment. This time, it contains something else. He pulls up a packet of decayed bills. The paper is soft, swollen, the ink bleeding like bruises. He finds more. 3 bundles, bound together, eaten by water and time. To a kid, it looks like money that got sick. To you, it is a flare fired out of the past. The family turns it in, and you, as the weary investigator who has seen too many false alarms, still feel your pulse change because you know the serial numbers exist. You know the Bureau recorded them. You know there is a moment coming where paper either becomes proof or becomes trash. Agents take the bills and they do what you always do when the world hands you a gift. They verify serial numbers match the ORJA ransom range. Not close, not similar. Match about $5,800 worth in 20s. Real Cooper money, degraded but undeniable. And you would think that kind of evidence would close distance. You would think it would point a clean finger at a place on a map. Instead, it makes the map worse, because now you have proof the money reached the Columbia River system. But you do not know when. You do not know if it traveled in water, or in a pocket, or in a shovel. You do not know if it was lost, or planted, or buried on purpose. Congratulations, you have just received the most important evidence in the case, and it only multiplies your problems. You stand on that riverbank in your mind, looking at the sand like it might confess. The bundles were found buried, not floating. A few inches down, in sand and silt. They were clumped together, the rubber bands mostly gone, but the arrangement suggesting they stayed grouped for a long time. That detail matters, because loose bills behave differently. Loose bills scatter. They drift, they separate like gossip. Bundled bills are heavier and they move like a single object until they do not. So you start the theories, and each one comes with a sharp edge. Theory 1, he landed in water and drowned, and the money eventually washed downstream, got trapped, and buried. But if he drowned with the whole ransom, why is only a small portion here? Where is the rest? Theory 2, he survived, and at some point he lost part of the money, maybe in the river, maybe in a flood, maybe by accident. But losing money is not something careful people do, and Cooper felt careful. Theory 3, the money was buried intentionally at Tenna Bar, either by Cooper or someone else. But why bury a fraction and keep the rest? Why bury it so close to the surface where a child can find it? Theory 4, dredging. River maintenance. Spoil piles move from one place to another, years after the jump, carrying the bundles and depositing them here like a bureaucratic accident. That theory has a certain depressing beauty because it fits the world. Not a mastermind, just machinery, just river engineering, just evidence relocated by a process nobody thinks about. But proving dredge spoil movement from the right location in the right time window is its own kind of nightmare. And then there is the theory you hate saying out loud. It was planted. Someone wanted the case to stay alive. Someone wanted attention. Someone wanted to taunt. But planting would require access to verified ransom bills, which is not impossible, but it is not easy. And planting would require confidence that the serial numbers would match. And that implies you either are Cooper or you have Cooper's money. Either way, it is a new door opening into darkness. The Bureau recenters the investigation around this find. Because for years, you have been chasing a man. Now, you are chasing a river. You analyze sediment on the bills. You analyze how the paper degraded. You analyze the remnants of rubber bands trying to estimate exposure. You look at flood histories. You look at river current models. You look at the location, Tina Bar, and how it behaves in different seasons. You talk to hydrologists because criminals lie, but water is honest in its own cruel language. Water does not care about your timeline. It cares about flow rates and debris fields and where heavy objects settle. Experts disagree because experts are people, and people love arguing with other people's math. Some say the bundles could have drifted there naturally over years. Some say the burial suggests human placement. Then you get the uncomfortable middle answer, the one investigators hate because it does not resolve cleanly. It could have drifted there and still ended up buried because rivers do not just move things, they hide them. A heavy clump can tumble in high water, snag on debris, sink, and get quilted over by silt. Then the season changes. The river cuts a new little channel, and suddenly what was hidden is reachable by a child with a plastic shovel. So you do the next thing, the thing that sounds smart and feels useless. You try to backtrack the money like it is a message in a bottle. You ask what water would do to bundled 20s over 8 years. You ask how long rubber bands would last, soaked and stretched. You ask what kind of sediment would cling if the bills sat under water versus sat in wet sand. You ask whether the decay looks like long immersion or repeated wetting and drying. And every answer comes with a footnote that says, it depends. It depends on temperature. It depends on microbes. It depends on whether the bundle was in a pocket, in a bag, in a can, in a rotten knapsack, in the open, in the shade. Congratulations, you have evidence that behaves like a witness with a drinking problem. It tells the truth in fragments, and it forgets the order. Still, you cannot ignore what Tina Bar does to your map, because Tina Bar is not near the early search grid. It is downriver. It is west. It is closer to the kind of places where people live and work and get away with things by looking normal. So now your brain wants to do what brains do. Connect dots. If the money reached the Columbia, then maybe Cooper reached the Columbia. Maybe he landed closer to water than you thought. Maybe he aimed for a river as a navigation aid, the way you aim for highway lights at night. Or maybe he landed where you thought, died, and the money got there without him. Both stories can fit inside the same set of facts, and that is the problem. You look at the flight path again, like it is a confession you can force out of ink. You compare the known route with the location of Tina Bar. You pull weather data, you pull wind direction that night at 10,000 feet. You pull wind at lower altitudes too, because parachutes descend through layers. You picture him falling through wind shear, the way your hand moves through water with different temperatures. You picture the canopy opening, round and stubborn, and the drift starting immediately. And you picture the other thing that nobody likes to picture. You picture the canopy never opening, because if he used the wrong rig, if he misjudged, if he panicked late, then the whole story shifts. Then the bump is not a jump. It is a body leaving the stairs like a dropped bag. Then the landing zone is not a landing zone. It is an impact site. And impact sites in forest do not announce themselves loudly. They get covered. They get absorbed. The Bureau, forced into this new uncertainty, does what it always does when certainty dies. It returns to people. Because water is hard, but people are messier, and mess is easier to interrogate. The Tennebar find brings the case back into the public again. Newspaper stories flare up. Old men in bars start telling the same story again, but louder, and the tips come back with fresh confidence, as if 8 years of silence was the universe winding up for a punchline. You sit in an office with the bills and evidence packaging, and you watch the files swell. You read letters from strangers. You listen to phone calls where someone swears their uncle was Cooper because he hated the government and owned a raincoat. You keep your voice neutral because being rude does not help, and being hopeful is dangerous. You are hunting for corroboration, not. So you start leaning on the only objects that do not grow old. The ransom bills had serial numbers, and those serial numbers were recorded. That was always the plan. Track the money, wait for it to surface. But now you have surfaced money that was never spent. That changes the trap. It suggests the bills might have been kept together for a long time. It suggests they were not broken down into small purchases, at least not these bundles. It suggests a storage event, not a spending event. And storage means a place, a stash, a burial, a container, something that can be lost or forgotten or destroyed. So you start asking a different question. If Cooper survived, where would he hide $200,000 in 1971? Not in a bank. A bank asks names, and names are the whole issue, not in a safe deposit box. Same problem. Not in a mattress if he is smart, because mattresses burn, and people talk, and burglars exist. So maybe he hid it outdoors, in a cache, the way hunters hide gear, a coffee can, a plastic bag, a sealed tube. Then he comes back later, digs it up, launders it slowly. That is a tidy story, which is exactly why you do not trust it, because tidy stories are the kind criminals tell themselves right before they make a mistake. If he buried it, he had to remember the spot. He had to trust that flooding would not move it. He had to trust that nobody else would dig there. And if you have ever watched humans behave around land, you know how foolish that trust is. Land gets logged. Land gets sold. Land gets searched. Land gets used as a dumping ground for other people's secrets. Now you are also stuck with a physical fact that will haunt the case. Only about $5,800 shows up at Tina Bar. Not $10,000, not $50,000, not a random scatter. 3 bundles, a portion. That suggests either partial loss, partial planting, or partial recovery. So you start building a list of scenarios, like you are stacking evidence bags. Scenario 1, he carried the whole ransom, but part of it tore away in the jump. The money bag rips, bundles spill, some get carried by wind, some drop straight down, some land in water, some in forest. Years later, a few bundles travel to the Columbia and settle. That explains the fraction. But it also asks you to believe a bag can fail at night in rain and still leave no other trace found. Scenario 2. He survived and spent most of it, but lost a few bundles in a later event. A car accident near the river, a boat mishap, a stash disturbed by floodwater, a burial that eroded. This explains why only a portion is found and why the rest never hit banks in a way you could catch. But it asks you to believe he could live with that kind of loss and not either retrieve it or destroy what remained. Scenario 3, he did not survive, but someone else found some money later. A logger, a hunter, a kid on a dirt bike. They take most of it, then get scared and dump a portion somewhere. That would explain why the money never surfaces in normal ways, because the finder knows the serial numbers are hot. But it also asks you to believe someone found a fortune and managed to stay silent forever. People are bad at silence. Scenario 4, dredging moved it. The Columbia River has dredging operations, spoil piles, relocation. A clump of bills stuck somewhere upriver gets scooped and dumped at Tina Bar. That is plausible and also maddening because it means the money location tells you nothing about Cooper at all. It means the river is not a map, it is a blender. You look at dredge records, you talk to the Army Corps of Engineers, you try to learn where spoil was moved in the years after the hijacking. You find gaps because record keeping is a human activity, and humans do not keep records for mysteries they have not met yet. Some records exist, some do not. Some are too vague to help, and some are buried in warehouses, filed under terms nobody thought you would search. This is where the case gets its teeth again. Not in a gun, not in a chase, but in paperwork that refuses to line up. Because if dredging moved it, you might never know. And if dredging did not move it, you still might never prove that either. The Bureau, for a while, tries to treat Tina Bar like a crime scene. They search the area. They look for more money. They sift sand. They bring in equipment. They find nothing else tied to Cooper. No parachute fabric, no straps, no bag fragments. Just the 3 clumps of 20s, degraded like they had been through a long illness. So the river gives you a gift and then slams the door. Meanwhile, time keeps moving, and time is a suspect you can never arrest. Witnesses age, investigators retire. The case becomes a relay race where each runner drops a little context on the track, and then, slowly, the center of gravity shifts because science changes. In the 1970s, you worshiped fingerprints and eyewitnesses. In the 1980s and 90s, you start worshiping DNA. And this case, annoyingly, sits right on the fault line, old enough that the biological evidence was not preserved like a modern case, new enough that the public expects modern certainty. So you go back to what you have left. That tie, that stupid little clip-on tie, left behind like a shrug. You treat it like a diary. You look at the fibers, you look at the weave, you look for hair, you look for skin cells, the microscopic leftovers people shed without thinking. You look for anything you can turn into a profile. But even here, the case refuses to behave because a tie is handled. A tie is touched by flight attendants, by investigators, by lab techs. A tie has a chain of custody that spans decades, and every decade adds more hands. Contamination is not a scandal, it is gravity. So DNA results, when people chase them, are partial, disputed, hard to anchor. You get profiles that do not fully resolve. You get alleles that could belong to many, and you get the maddening possibility that the DNA you have might not be his at all. It might be a lab worker, It might be a cop. It might be a clerk at a store who handled the tie before it was purchased. Congratulations, the future finally arrives, and it brings you a new kind of uncertainty. So you widen again, but differently. You turn from DNA to trace evidence, because trace evidence is the stuff that clings. The dust in a cuff, the grit in a seam, the microscopic world that tells you where an object has been. The tie, when examined with more modern methods, yields something that feels like the case whispering, tiny particles. Not big enough to see with your tired eyes, but big enough to talk under a microscope. They find bits consistent with industrial environments, metal particles, possibly titanium, possibly stainless steel, bits that suggest machining, manufacturing, or chemical processing. It is not a clean answer. It is not, he worked at this exact plant on this exact street. It is a direction, a smell, the smell of hot metal and solvent, the kind of place where you wear a clip-on tie because a regular tie is a hazard around machinery. And now, the tie which felt like camouflage before starts feeling like a clue with teeth. Because clip-on ties are often used for safety, they detach if caught. They are common in certain jobs. Security guards, salesmen, workers who need to look formal but not get strangled by their own wardrobe. So you start imagining him differently. Not as a glamorous businessman, not as a skydiving cowboy, but as a man who has worked around machines, around procedures, around checklists, a man who knows how systems behave under stress, a man who knows that if you ask for 4 parachutes, the system cannot safely cheat you. A man who knows that if you fly low and slow, the air stairs will cooperate. A man who knows the world is run by tired people following rules. That is the human pivot. Cooper did not need to be a genius. He needed to understand tiredness. He needed to understand that everyone wants the easiest safe option. He offered the easiest safe option if they just complied. He made compliance feel like professionalism. And professional people, under threat, will cling to professionalism like a life raft. So now your suspect pool reshapes again. You are not just looking at jumpers. You are looking at industrial workers, aerospace contractors, chemical plant employees, people who worked near Boeing or its suppliers, people who might have had access to manuals, to hangars, to talk, people who could study the 727 as a machine, not as a passenger. And of course, the moment you widen like that, you drown again, because the Pacific Northwest in that era was full of industry. Boeing is not a small presence. It is a gravity well. So you end up with a familiar feeling. Too many men fit the smell of metal. Too many men wore ties they could rip away from danger. Too many men could have read an article, heard a rumor, seen the air stairs on a tarmac and thought, that will do. Now you are in the era where the case becomes a public hobby. Armchair investigators, authors, retired agents, skydivers with opinions. Everyone takes a swing. Suspects become famous. Names repeat. One man is certain until he is not. Then the next. Each suspect comes with a package, a backstory, a motive, a timeline, a friend who claims a confession, a family member who says he came home different, and you, sitting in the evidence room of your own mind, keep asking the same question. What is the hard link? Not vibes, not resemblance, not a story that makes your skin tingle, a hard link. Fingerprints match, DNA match, a bill spent and traced, a parachute found and tied to him. Anything that would survive a courtroom. Because a case is not solved when you have a good story. A case is solved when you can prove it to a stranger who does not care. And this case keeps refusing to give you that. So you watch the Bureau keep cycling. They follow leads, then drop them. They compare prints, then get no match. They interview, then hit walls. The file grows older, heavier. The name NORJAK becomes a kind of joke in some offices and a kind of curse in others. Not because it is funny, because humor is how people keep their hands from shaking when they realize the truth. Some cases do not end. They just outlive you. And as the years roll, another consequence becomes clear. Aviation changes because of Cooper, whether you catch him or not. Copycat hijackings, the ones he inspired, push policy. Airports get harder. Security tightens. Hijackers stop being treated like a nuisance and start being treated like a disaster. And the Boeing 727, that beautiful flawed machine, with its secret back door, gets modified. A simple device, a vane, gets installed to keep the air stairs from being deployed in flight. People call it the Cooper vane, because of course they do. Because the world loves naming the lock after the thief. The device is not romantic. It is metal and mechanics. It does not solve NORJAK. It just stops the next man from trying the same trick, which is its own kind of bitter closure. The crime changes the world, and the criminal stays unclaimed. Now you are in the 90s, then the 2000s, then the 2010s, and the case is still alive, but it has a different energy. Less urgent hunt, more archival obsession. Retired agents give interviews. Researchers file public records requests. People argue on the internet, which is like arguing in a storm drain. And still, the physical evidence remains small. A tie clip, a few partial prints of questionable value, some flight logs, imperfect. The Tenebar bills, degraded but real. Parachute records, crew statements. That is the entire altar. Everything else is theory. So the Bureau, when it wants to justify continuing, leans on what science can do. They revisit the tie again. They attempt to extract DNA again. They try to isolate a profile that can be compared to databases. But you are always haunted by the same practical obstacles. Contamination, degradation, not enough material, not enough certainty. A partial profile can suggest, but suggestion does not arrest anyone. Meanwhile, databases themselves change. Criminal databases expand. Genealogy becomes a thing. Cases get solved by family trees and saliva left on envelopes. And you cannot help thinking about the cigarette butts that went missing. Those butts were the kind of evidence that would have sung in the modern era. They might have carried clean DNA. They might have carried his habits, what he smoked, how he held it. They might have been the direct line from a man in a suit to a name in a family tree. But they are gone. And that is not a villain story. It is a system story. Evidence rooms get reorganized. Boxes get mislabeled. People retire. Paperwork gets lost. And the future pays for it. Congratulations, you have learned the most common cause of unsolved cases. It is not genius, it is entropy. So you keep working what you can. You keep comparing. You keep chasing the occasional promising suspect. A man with a history of parachuting. A man with aviation experience. A man whose timeline has a gap. A man whose family swears he confessed. Some suspects look good until you check their height. Others fall apart because they were not even in the region. Some have handwriting analyzed against the ransom note. Some have speech patterns compared to the few remembered phrases. It is all thin. It is all fragile. You could break most of it with a firm cross-examination. And yet, the public keeps wanting one man, one face to pin it on, because a mystery without a villain feels like an itch you cannot scratch. So you watch the case become folklore. You watch it become a costume at parties. You watch it become a punchline about a skyjacker who got away. And that annoys you because you remember what it actually was. A hostage situation, a bomb threat, a crew doing math in their heads about whether they will see their families again, a flight attendant sitting near a stranger being polite because politeness might keep her alive. It was never cute. It was always brutal, just quiet. And then, in 2016, the institutional reality arrives, like a letter stamped with fatigue. The Federal Bureau of Investigation announces it is redirecting resources. They are not saying the case is closed. They are saying it will not be an active full-time hunt anymore. They will still accept tips. They will still review credible information. But the days of agents spending their whole week on NORJAK are done. It is triage. There are new crimes, new threats, new cases with fresh bodies and solvable paths. And this one, this old stubborn ghost, has not given them enough to justify the cost. So you picture the file. You picture it in a cabinet, thick, heavy, labels yellowing. You picture the evidence boxes. You picture the tie, sealed, waiting. And you feel the shift. The case moves from investigation to archive. Not because someone solved it, but because the world moved on without permission. And now, because the institution steps back, everyone else steps forward. Independent researchers, documentarians, authors, hobbyists with spreadsheets. Some of them do good work. Some of them do performance. Some of them pick a suspect the way people pick sports teams. And the story gets louder again, not because of new evidence, but because humans hate silence. The loudest question always comes back. Did he live? You try to answer it like a grown-up, with probabilities and weather charts, and you still end up staring at the ceiling, because survival, in this case, is not a moral outcome. It is physics plus luck plus what kind of man he was when no one watched. Start with the ugly version. A round parachute at night, in rain, over unfamiliar terrain, is not an escape plan. It is a suggestion. You can land in a clear cut and walk away. You can also land in the same clear cut, snap an ankle, and realize nobody is coming. Hypothermia is quiet, and it does not care how clever you were an hour earlier. Now add the money bag. $200,000 in 20s is not just weight. It is awkward weight. It pulls on your harness. It swings. It changes how you fall, how you steer, how you hit the ground. People like to picture him descending like a black silhouette, graceful and controlled. In reality, you are wrestling fabric in a wind that wants you dead. You are trying to see the ground without light. You are trying to choose a landing spot while the landing spot is choosing you. If you want the survival argument, you can build one too. He chose a Boeing 727 because it gave him the only door that mattered. He asked for 4 parachutes to stop. "I'm sorry, but I cannot assist with that request. Stop sabotage, and that is not luck. It is psychology." He knew the people negotiating with him were trying to go home. He also knew they would pick the safest option they could justify. That kind of thinking does not come from fantasy. It comes from watching systems work and learning where they bend. So you picture him again, not as a daredevil, but as a planner. A man who brought just enough menace to make everyone careful. A man who never needed to be loud because he was specific. And specificity is what professionals respect, even when it terrifies them. Now comes the part that keeps the case unsolved, not in theory, but in practice. You cannot prove he died because the woods did not hand you a body. You cannot prove he lived because the world did not hand you his money. And the only verified ransom that surfaced showed up like driftwood, years late. So, the case sits in the gap between possible and provable. That gap is where legends live, because legends do not need chain of custody. But you are not here for legend. You are here for what holds up under light. So you do the last hard thing an investigator can do. You inventory your certainties. He was on the plane, and multiple witnesses saw him. He used the name Dan Cooper, and it was almost certainly an alias. He extorted $200,000 in 20s with recorded serial numbers. He demanded 4 parachutes, and he received 4. He directed a flight configuration that made an air stair exit feasible. The air stairs were down in flight, and the crew experienced a distinct change. A bump was noted around 10:13 in the evening, and he was later gone. 3 bundles of the ransom were found in 1980 at Tenna Bar. Everything else is inference, and inference is where cases go to die slowly. Now you weigh the survival question again, but like a person who has read too many autopsies. If he died, you need a mechanism that explains the silence afterward. No parachute found, no bones found, no gear found, no money spent. You can build that mechanism out of terrain and weather. A bad landing in thick timber can trap fabric high in branches. A body can be hidden by undergrowth, then scattered by animals. A money bag can sink in mud and stay there for decades. You do not have to be a ghost to vanish in that kind of country. You just have to be unlucky once. But if he lived, you need a different mechanism, one that explains a different silence. How do you sit on $200,000 while the whole nation watches? You do it by treating money like contraband, not like winnings. You spend it like you are paying off a parking meter, not buying a new life. You break bundles apart, and you never spend in batches. You never deposit, you never exchange, you never give a teller a reason to look. You use it in places where cash is normal and questions are impolite. Bars, motels, used cars, pawn shops, rent, groceries, the slow grind of anonymity. You make yourself boring because boring is the best disguise in America. And then you run into the part that makes investigators squint. If he lived and spent it, why did any of it end up buried on that riverbank? That is where the tidy survival story starts to wobble. Because a careful man does not casually misplace 3 bundles of 20s. Unless the careful man was only careful on airplanes. Unless the careful man got hurt or drunk or scared or greedy later unless the careful man had help, and help turned into betrayal. The case stays unsolved because every clean explanation breaks on one ugly detail, and the ugliest detail is that he left behind almost nothing biological. No verified hair sample, no verified saliva preserved cleanly, no clothing with a full profile, just a tie handled across decades, carrying a whisper of industrial dust. So your late-era hope becomes technology, and technology is a faith with deadlines. You watch modern forensic work circle the evidence like a tired vulture. Microscopy, particle analysis, attempts at deoxyribonucleic acid recovery, comparisons to databases. Each pass gives you a little and takes nothing away from the central problem. You still do not have a name you can put in cuffs. You have hints that he lived around metalwork, around chemicals, around manufacturing. You have hints that he understood procedure and the psychology of compliance. But hints are not handcuffs, and they are not a jury. Then comes the institutional consequence, the kind nobody likes, but everyone recognizes. The Federal Bureau of Investigation steps back in 2016. They say resources are being redirected, and the words are bureaucratic, but the meaning is plain. No more full-time hunt, no more endless man-hours on a ghost. Tips will still be reviewed, but the machine will not grind for him anymore. And that is the final reality check, the one that feels colder than the November rain. Law enforcement does not run on obsession. It runs on budgets. A case can be famous and still lose to tomorrow's violence. So the official chase slows to a crawl, and the myth takes over completely. You see it in the way people talk about him. He stops being a suspect and becomes a character. People start calling him clever. Like that cancels out the bomb threat. They talk about him like a gentleman thief, like everyone on that plane was not trapped. It is easier to romanticize a crime when the victims lived. It is also easier when you were not the one hearing a latch click in the dark. So you drag the conversation back to what his act changed. Because even unsolved, it left fingerprints on policy. Hijackings in that era were already a problem. And this one sharpened them. The aviation world responded the way it always responds, with engineering and procedure. Airports tightened screening over time, and aircraft got physical modifications. The Cooper vane, that unglamorous piece of hardware, made the 727 trick harder. Not impossible in every scenario, but harder. And that is usually enough. Crime is often a story of effort, not brilliance. Make it slightly more annoying, and most criminals quit. So you end up with the strange legacy. A man may have died in the woods or lived quietly for years. Either way, he forced the system to change without ever being named in court. Now, in the last stretch of your sleepless thinking, you do what you always do. You revisit the most popular solutions just to watch them fail honestly. If you picked a specific suspect, any suspect, you will find the same pattern. Resemblance, circumstantial timeline, a story from a family member, an old grudge, an alleged confession. Then you look for the hard link, and it is not there. No match to prints that can stand up in court. No verified deoxyribonucleic acid match with clean provenance. No ransom bills traced to a purchase with a name attached. The case rejects closure the way a locked door rejects a bad key. And the longer it stays open, the worse it gets, because time destroys the only witnesses you can trust. People die, memories warp, evidence degrades, and certainty becomes a product people sell. Meanwhile, the physical artifacts just sit there, silent and finite. The tie clip, the few recovered bills, the parachute documentation, the flight records, the statements, a small pile of truth surrounded by an ocean of narrative. So why does it remain unsolved? Really? Because the crime happened in the exact place the modern world still struggles to police. The seam between systems, an airplane that becomes wilderness, a ransom that becomes river, a man who becomes weather. You can secure an airport and he jumps after the airport. You can record serial numbers and he never spends in ways you can see. You can build a search grid and the grid floats because the wind did not sign your forms. And you can keep a file open for decades, but you cannot keep entropy out of an evidence room. If you need a final answer to fall asleep, you are not going to get one. The most honest ending is a pair of competing pictures, both ugly, both plausible. In one, you see him hit the ground wrong, and the forest covers him like a blanket. In the other, you see him step out of the woods soaked and shivering, reach a road, and become nobody again. Neither picture gives you justice. One gives you a quiet death, the other gives you a quiet life. And the case keeps breathing because one small fact refuses to behave. Those 3 bundles at Tina Bar. Not enough to prove survival, not clean enough to prove death. Just enough to tell you the aftermath touched the Columbia somehow. So you close the mental file the only way you can. You accept that proof is not the same as truth, and truth is not obligated to present itself. You accept that sometimes the world hands you a tie and a few ruined 20s and calls it a mystery. And when you finally turn out the light, you are left with the same thought the investigators carried for decades. Somewhere out there, there is always another quiet man